Okay, cool. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out to our week 4 event. We'll be presented by Sarah today. We'll be doing network state, which is a sort of new emerging topic within the blockchain slash decentralization broader movement. So it'll be building off of some of the topics that have been talked about for the past few weeks, but it'll go in a little different direction. And then Sarah has some cool stuff in the slides to show you guys and talk about. And I think you guys will enjoy it. So thank you very much. And then, Sarah's the speaker. So round of applause for her.
Okay, yeah. So I'm gonna be talking about network state for today. And so first of all, here's kind of okay. Okay, so here's kind of like a brief overview of everything I'm gonna be talking about today. So first we're gonna talk about like why is Bitcoin controversial, right? And then we're gonna make a huge jump into why we might need new nations in general. Then I'm gonna talk about what is a nation state, what is a network state, a little bit about history and blockchain, the three Leviathans, the one commandment, why we need network states, the don't die network state, and then I'm going to talk about Zuzalo as well. And just to give like a disclaimer, this is like a pretty theoretical and political talk, and I'm not like a political person, so I had to do a lot of research for this presentation. So like, if there's anything controversial or if there's any like questions you might have, like come to me privately after the presentation is over. And then also a lot of these concepts are based off of the views of this guy named Balaji, which I'll talk about later on. Okay. Okay, so first of all, let's kind of relate everything back to like Bitcoin, right? And so Bitcoin has always been super controversial because it's decentralized, right? It operates without a central authority or any sort of government oversight. And the reason why is because, right, you have like these peer-to-peer networks of nodes that all have a copy of the Bitcoin ledger, right? It has the entire history of all the transactions that have ever been done. And it's like all these computers around the world have this copy, right? So again, it's kind of hard to falsify things. If you falsify something on one computer, like all the other computers still have like the true copy, right? Again, its encryption uses proof of work, so no one can really tamper with it, right? No one can like alter its history, so it's like immutable. And so you have some countries that are pretty like receptive to Bitcoin, such as El Salvador, that's even adopted it as like a nationally accepted form of currency. But then you have like other countries such as the US that recently, like the FBA recently issued this warning saying like, oh, don't use cryptocurrency exchanges that like where you have like no KYC, right? Or in China, they like completely banned ICOs, which are initial coin offerings, which is a way that many crypto protocols fundraise. They also like have banned cryptocurrency mining and crypto transactions in general to pave the way for their own digital currency. But like even if these countries put like a ban on crypto, it's like if you have like a VPN and like everything is anonymous, like you can technically still like do things, you know what I mean? And so this kind of like goes back to the concept that like in general, people and governments are really opposed to change, right? Like to changing the status quo or infringing upon the sacrilegious, right? And so why might you want like a new nation, right? So as Balaji says, quote, we want to be able to peacefully start a new state for the same reason we want a bare plot of earth, a blank sheet of paper, et cetera, right? Because we want to build something new without any historical constraint. However, it oftentimes like making a fresh state can oftentimes be like technologically infeasible, politically impossible, or judicially punishable, right? Like imagine a land where you can't just like acquire bare land. You have to like knock down a building in order to like get more land, which is actually very similar to the world that we live in today, right? And this is where you hear on the news like, oh, in SF, like people want to build more houses to like house the homeless, but then oh, they want to like knock down this very historical gas station in order to like build these new apartments. Then you have people like sitting down and protesting, and then you got all this like conflict in the news, right? Essentially, it's just like endless conflict over scarce resources. And so, kind of a solution to this, like this other way of making new governments that I want to talk about is called the network state. And so this idea was kind of developed by this guy named Balaji, who was the CTO of Coinbase, a general partner at A16Z. and the author of the book, The Network State, right? And so to kind of give it in like one informal sentence, a network state is basically a highly aligned online community with a capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. So this is like pretty confusing, but I'm going to break all the components down in the next two slides. But it's really kind of this idea of like cloud first, land last, right? So you're gonna have like build an online community, like a digital online community first that eventually manifests itself into the physical world. And like, why do people want to do this? Well, there's this thing called the One Commandment, which I'll also go over later. And think of it as kind of like the moral failure in society that you really want to fix, that you're willing to like band around and actually take action towards solving it via like developing a network state. And so really in a network state, people are ideologically aligned, but geographically decentralized, right? Like just how Bitcoin is a decentralized currency, the network state is a decentralized country. Okay, so to So to understand what a network state is, we have to understand what a nation state is first, right? So we kind of break it down to two words. So you have nation, which kind of think of it as like, okay, like there's like a common descent of people, there's like a common language. You have the state, which is simply the administrative layer over that nation. And once you realize the distinction between the two and what actually is a nation state, you're going to understand that like not all countries are actually nation states, right? You have like nation states like the Japanese or the Spanish, but you're also going to have like nations without states, right? Like the Kurds or the Catalonians, right? Like these people, they have like very long histories dating back to like the 1700s, the 1800s. Like they're legitimate groups of people, but they don't have any territory, aka they don't have any state, right? You also have like multi-ethnic states that are trying to create like proposition nations and just like a bunch of other things, right? And so then you'll start to see that like on a world map, it's not actually representative of like all the groups and like all the abstractions there are. And it's also like not how things in the world always will be, right? Because in the UN right now, we have what, like 170 or 180 nations in the world. And if you were to count all of these different abstractions, we would probably have over like 600 countries in the world. Okay, so let's get back to talking about what is a network state. So I'm going to kind of like break everything down. So first of all, a network state is a highly aligned online community. Okay, so think about this as like, right? People think of themselves as being part of the same community, right? It's at like the top of your identity stack. So for example, I say like, oh, I'm Sarah. I'm a first year at UCLA. I'm from the Bay Area. I was born in Canada, right? Like this is all part of my identity. And then you'll see like on Twitter, people in their Twitter profiles will have like $ BTC because they're like Bitcoin maximalists and they're gonna like defend it to the end because it's like part of their identity, right? People are also going to have a capacity for collective action, right? So like in a network state, you're gonna have leadership, right? And so think of it like, let's say I have a Twitter account and I have 1 million followers. I post a tweet and I get like 1,000 likes. That's not collective action. Collective action is when you put something out to 1,000 people, you get 1,000 interactions. You put something out to 1 million people, you get 1 million interactions. It's kind of like, think of it as like moving as a group, right? You're doing almost like this digital dance of sorts in like a formation. Like people will start to view you as a unit. And then like, you know, when people on the outside look inwards, they're going to be like, oh my God, like these people, like I don't want to mess with them, but I really, really respect them. It's all kind of just about like becoming one. Next, you want to like crowdfund territory and move in together. So then rather than like buying territory in one place or trying to like negotiate sovereignty up front, you kind of like, again, right? Like cloud first, land last. You're going to build the community in the cloud first and then crowdfund physical real estate on the earth. And, you know, that can be like office space, that can be homes, that can be shops. Basically, it's just like spread all over the world in like clusters rather than being concentrated in one place. And then you're going to be able to network these clusters together using the internet into a network archipelago. And so again, this is kind of like manifesting the physical footprint of your like digital community. And like, why might you need this? Like think about Google, like why do they have offices all over the world, right? Like, yeah, there's kind of less of a need for in-person offices like these days you can argue, but like nothing really beats in-person stuff, right? And then a network state also wants to be internationally recognized so it can do deals with other nations. So this is kind of like all the components of a network state. And in this pyramid of like what defines a network state, there's also like sub-levels, right? So for example, like a network archipelago, that's like having a physical footprint, but no like international recognition. Also, maybe you start off with like a startup society, which is just purely a digital network union. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about history and how history and blockchain relate to the network state, right? Because like what George Orwell says, like, oh, to control the future, you must like understand the past, or some variation of that. So what is history? History is like a cryptic epic of twisting trajectories, right? It's very unreliable, inconsistent. It's like an unreliable, inconsistent, long, non-straightforward evolution of time, right? And so there's a few different types of histories. You have microhistory, which is the history of reproducible systems, right? Good measurements of the past equal better prediction of the future. You also have macrohistory, which is the history of non-reproducible systems, right? Everything is completely unpredictable. And macrohistory is human history, right? We also have something called digital macrohistory, which we can see all over today, right? Like on your Apple Watch, like you record the number of steps, you can record like your heart rate, et cetera, et cetera. Even like Uber drivers, right? Like Uber drivers will have their rating, which is like an accumulation of all of the past rides they have done in the past, right? And it's going to influence their future behavior because if you have like a 5-star Uber rating, they're gonna want to like maintain that rating, right? And like drive well. Um, and so you also have this problem kind of like bots ruining digital macro history. And so the thing about history is that it's always been top down, right? Political winners have always been the ones to write history. And so this is why the Bitcoin blockchain is um, kind of insane, right? Because it gives like a bottom up history that is extremely hard to falsify because of its encryption and because of its immutability, right? And also literally has everything. Like in the Bitcoin blockchain, I can see like who sent what money to what, like how much, like the timestamp, like everything. And so the idea is that you can use the Bitcoin blockchain to also record non-financial history. And you can use this with like Merkle roots, like Merkle trees. Like I can't really explain the tech, but if you ask like Jason or Alan, they probably know. And so essentially, crypto history is basically like cryptographically verifiable macro history. Like the blockchain is to paper as what paper was to oral records. And so in the network state, you know, like a network state would theoretically have an integrated cryptocurrency that's going to be like the digital backbone, right? It's going to manage like all your internal digital assets, your smart contracts, your Web3 citizen logins, birth and marriage certificates, basically just like any like bureaucratic process that a nation state manages via pieces of paper. And because it's protected by encryption and can coordinate all the functions of a state across the borders of legacy nation states. Okay, so I also kind of want to talk about why a network might be like effective in actually like governing a state, right? And so biology has this concept of the three leviathans, which are kind of these like three all-powerful forces that stand above all men, which are God, state, and the network, right? And so what's interesting about the network is that it's like peer-to-peer interactions of people with each other, right? Versus being top down like God and state. So, you know, like if you do something bad, if you steal, like God and state are going to punish you. The thing is that the network won't even let you do these bad things because, like, first of all, the encryption prevents you from doing so. And then also, like, their form of punishment will, for example, be like locking people out of buildings or like freezing their funds. And China actually does this, right? They will literally disconnect people from the network, right? So, for example, like during COVID, you had like red and green codes. And then all of a sudden, people found out that, like, oh no, my WeChat doesn't work, which is literally like PayPal plus like your entire social graph, or that, oh, suddenly I can't travel. Like they will, it's literally like a form of digital exile, which as you can see today, as we become like increasingly like interdependent on the internet, like this has like a huge effect. Okay, so now I want to talk about why we might want a network state. And so biology has this idea of the one commandment, which is kind of like the moral differentiation from society at large, right? Because think about it. In society today, there's like a lot of moral failures that like we might think about, right? We might be like, oh no, there's like an obesity epidemic, or like, oh my God, like bipolarism is so bad, right? Um, and so like the one commandment is kind of like the mission statement for a startup. It's like, like you're trying to fix one moral failing of society at a time, right? It's like the reason why you're kind of doing this network state. And so you can really get like social support for this and add like several levels of defense, right? Like you can literally be the president of your own startup society or network state, defend why society is wrong in XYZ way, and recruit people who also believe in this. And so to give like a theoretical example, let's say we have like keto kosher, the sugar-free society, right? Like your moral failure that you're focusing on is like the history of the USDA food pyramid that covers like corporate sugarification of the globe and like this obesity epidemic that we have, right? And you're gonna like operationalize this cure in the form of a partially physical network archipelago, right? So again, like cloud first, land last, you're gonna have your online community that crowdfunds territories in the world, like apartment buildings, gyms, etc. And you might take like, for example, a very extreme approach where you literally ban all processed foods and sugar at the border, right? Maybe eventually you're going to set like a default for fitness and exercise. Maybe you're going to even like bulk purchase glucose meters for like all your members. And so like one thing to note is that like to change the world, you really don't need many people to do so, right? Like throughout history, it's only ever been like a small group of highly motivated people that like change the world. And like in recent times, we can see this in like Facebook and Google and Amazon, right? Like completely changes the way we interact with other people, completely changes the way that we like learn about stuff, completely changes the way that we shop, etc. Okay, so then we kind of get to like introduce this idea of like sanctuary cities for like these different industries. I mean, that we might want to like advance research on without like restriction, right? Like we could have sanctuary cities for cryptocurrency, sanctuary cities for biotech, where federal law really isn't enforced. And so Ology has this like huge hatred for like the FDA to use as an example, right? He's like, oh my God, like the FDA really holds people back, right? And the FDA is this bureaucratic organization that like it monitors like, okay, what can we eat, like what can we consume, like etc., in the name of public health. And so right now in the world there's this problem of regulatory harmonization, which is where you have a small group of unelected bureaucrats who write like laws for the entire world, right? And so think about it. Like basically a lot of small countries in the world will like outsource all of their regulation to like the FDA, to the SEC, because they're like, okay, if this is good enough for America's standards, then it must be good enough for our standards, right? And like, if I were to ask you like, okay, who's on the FDA? Like you're not going to be able to tell me because like everyone's anonymous, right? Their career terms are like unlimited. So they literally have like these people who have like no accountability towards anyone are basically just like running the world. And it's only really when you like exit the state and gain sovereignty that you're able to like reinvent like physical innovation, right? Like it's really going to be outside the monopoly of state regulation where we like, for example, solve the problem of how do we get life extension. And it's kind of like this difference between new institutions versus like old institutions that were built by their time and simply inherited by their heirs, right? Because you know what I mean? Like people complain all the time, like, oh no, like the Supreme Court, like the way it's designed, it has like so much like power over like people's individual liberties and their autonomy. And like, oh, Congress today, like we have things like filling in the tree or like filibuster that the founding fathers didn't know that we would become so bipolar, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Like this is why it takes like years to build a train station in the Bay Area versus just like a day in China, right? Like that's like 1,000x faster. And so if you look to history, like why network states actually might become a thing, right? Like if you think about what kinds of people are immigrants, like who leaves one country and goes to another, it's always going to be the people who are the politically powerless, right? Because new money doesn't control government. It's not about being financially wealthy. It's about being like politically powerless because the rich must persuade, but the powerful can compel. Also like, in history, like when people discover the new world, they like move there and all these like different experiments in like democracy and capitalism that really propagated back to Europe. Okay, so I want to talk about another network state that's currently being developed. So there's this guy named like Brian Johnson. He was the founder of Venmo. and Blueprint, which maybe you heard about like on Twitter or the news or something, which is this like very extreme self-care regimen of like controlling his food, diet, and sleep, right? Like this guy literally eats 50 pills a day, 30 or 50 pills a day. He eats his dinner at 11 a.m. so that he can like digest it for 8 hours before he goes to sleep. Like he's literally like the world's most measured humans, like all of his organs, etc. Right? And so basically he's trying to build this network state that has this like new societal structure with the sole purpose of helping its citizens not die, because there's literally no government in the world today that helps its citizens not die. And I got to hear Balaji kind of speak more about it at the Akshay Summit, and he literally like proposed ideas such as like the enhanced Olympics to kind of like push the boundaries of humans, right? Because think about like Lance Armstrong. He literally like had cancer, recovered from cancer, and won the Tour de France. Like, yes, he has a lot of grit and a lot of discipline, but also he was like jacked up on steroids. You know what I mean? And so it's like this idea of literally having people like voluntarily become experiments to kind of like push the limits of like what is physically capable by humans or like what we can do, right? Because there's actually like a lot of this kind of like stuff that already exists in the world, but we kind of have this problem of the drug lag, which is that like the FDA's time it takes to approve drugs that saves like X% of people actually like kills more people, right? And so Balaji kind of talked about this in terms of like COVID vaccinations, right? Like we could have had COVID vaccines in 1 week. Instead, it took like months and months and months and months. And the only reason why we got it eventually was because like there's this lab that committed like civil disobedience and then like, did its stuff. But he's like, we should have just had people who are willing to like test the vaccines like right then. So we could have given it to people who actually need it, right? And like if we can have drugs like marijuana, why not have like other drugs like myostatin that like has been proven back in like 2013 to like jack you up and elevate your metabolic rate and etc. And like a lot of this sounds very like dystopian, maybe like unethical and just very extreme. But as Balaji says, no plane crashes, no planes, no train crashes, no trains. And then and the top is a picture of me, Brian Johnson, and Balaji after we worked out at Nas house in Dubai. This is like last week. It's kind of funny. And then that's a picture of Balaji talking at Akshay Summit, also in Dubai. And then finally, I kind of want to end off with the other real network state that has already happened. All these pictures are stolen off of my friend's Instagram, who helped to co-initiate this. So there's this thing called Zuzulu that happened last year, which was this 2-month invite-only gathering in like early 2023 that like Vitalik helped initiate, and he's like one of the co-founders of Ethereum. And they literally just created like a pop-up city in Montenegro, right? Like it's kind of you level up like a conference which brings together thousands of people, but only for a week. A hacker house which can house maybe at most like 20 people, and also a network state, right? And you just get to bring about this like community of people who are very passionate about like ZK proofs or like longevity, or like biotech and like European rationalists, right? They also had this thing called like ZooPass, which was this identity system based on ZK proofs to prove that you were a resident of Zuzulu while still being like anonymous, right? And so like the lifestyle of these people is literally getting to be like passionate about like advancing the future state of the world that they see while like, eating breakfast with Vitalik or like rescuing puppies or doing cold plunges or getting like concerts from Grimes, you know what I mean? Just like very, very insane. And there is a Zuzulu. So right now there's also like decentralized Zuzulu. So they're letting people like start their own Zuzulus if they want. I think there's like 2 in Africa that have been like going on. But they're also organizing a Zuzulu 2.0 in Bangkok this year, which I may take a gap quarter in the fall to go to. So if it's good, I will come back next year and do a presentation on my experience with that. But other than that, thank you so much for listening to the presentation.